welcome back to another edition of Software Without Borders. I'm your co-host, Jarret Streiner, and with me is the CEO of Accelerance, Andy Hilliard, and our guest, Tom Cooper. Tom Cooper is the Senior Vice President of Delivery at Accelerance. He's responsible for coaching customers as they leverage global teams to implement incredible software delivery. Tom has led performing software and technology projects and teams since the 1990s for Fortune 500 companies, tech companies, and in startups. Welcome, Tom.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about leading distributed teams. Now, Tom, since you are the expert in this, we want to understand with traditional management styles, they really kind of struggle with remote teams. So what kind of approaches have you adopted to lead distributed teams to outperform those co-leaded teams?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if we go back pre-COVID, we had some folks who were working remotely. I've done remote work for many, many years, but a lot of companies weren't pre-COVID. And so many companies weren't very good at managing their co-located teams. And then when we distribute folks, whether they're working from home or whether they're just working remotely in general, it makes it more challenging. And I think recognizing that people want to contribute things that matter and they want to feel like they're part of something, we often overlook that. We get so focused on the tasks that we don't think about the people portion of the overall puzzle.
Tom, you and I have been working together for 15 years or so.
Quite a long time.
It's been a long time, yeah. And we've worked on with many different clients and prospects. What I'd like to hear from you is you mentioned co-location versus remote, distributed, right? But what other sort of trends in general have you seen with regards to the use of outsourcing, the use of distributed talent, and just companies that either embrace or, how has that evolved over the last 10 or 20 years?
Well, it's interesting. I think often I'm reminded, if I can be philosophical for just a minute, there's a computer science luminary by the name of Donald Knuth. And one of the things that he said is that premature optimization is the root of all evil. And let me give you two quick examples of that. One is in product management. If you say, we need a system that lets us place an order. So we're working with a client. We went through that process. We made the smallest unit of addressable space and order. We get to the end of the project. Things are great. They say, oh, by the way, we need bulk orders too. Well, fundamentally, it wasn't designed to do bulk orders because we optimized for one order. And we didn't address that in the product management planning process early enough. And it left us with a huge kind of technical debt. The other example is one that we've seen over and over again, Andy, and it is, hey, I need some engineers because my team just isn't able to keep up. And if I could just get some engineers, that would make things better for me. And that's true. They do need additional engineering talent, but often where they get in trouble is they get that part of the process running really fast, but they haven't done the work on the product management side to make sure that there's enough developer-ready stories going into the queue. So then they end up with engineers who are less productive. So to get to the root of your question, tied back to this philosophical answer, is if you are too quick to say, my problem is, you're going to run into great difficulty when it comes to solving the problem because you might really efficiently solve the wrong problem. And I think that's the fundamental thing that we hit over and over again.
So a problem around my problem is that statement and not thinking more deeply about exactly how to solve the problem and through what methods and to set up their environment in order to ultimately solve the end in mind problem and not necessarily just the tactical or hair on fire problem they might have, right? So how should companies, have they evolved, or it seems to me that outsourcing has become much more accessible, much more viable.
Yep.
And the easiest problem definition is I need more bodies. And it's a simple math for them. It's like, 2x bodies equals 2x amount of work.
Right.
That may or may not be a correct mathematical conversion, actually. It may actually be the opposite, because if you're bringing in distributed bodies and you don't have a way to organize them, measure them, motivate them, empower them, then the math doesn't work. It's not 1 + 1. Additive is not even part of the equation, right?
Absolutely. And I think foundationally, one question that we ought to be asking is, how do I turn a set of talented distributed engineers into a highly productive team? Because we've seen with the dream teams in sports, you can get super talented players that don't actually give you the output that you want. And so it's
Mm.
really about thinking, how do we get the team to operate as a team? How do we get people to work together, even across borders and across time zones and across cultures and all those kinds of things? And that's often overlooked because we're more focused on the tactical. Hey, I got to get this next release out. I've got this backlog of features. I got a customer that's really upset because we haven't shipped it yet. How do I get that moving? And that is a problem that needs to be solved urgently. But if you focus exclusively on that, you're not going to get the 5x, 10x, 20x improvement in output that you're hoping for when you bring in additional team members.
Well, how would you wrap your arms around thinking holistically about efficacy, about team dynamics, about value, velocity in the engineering? Even if you don't outsource, if you think, well, my team is size X, could it be size 0.8x, but also produce 1.2? And if I were then to extend it like offshore, where you can drive down, costs, but at the same time have a smaller footprint, but a larger output or a better outcome. How do you wrap your arms around all of those variables, and what do you need to do in order to come to a strategic direction, a roadmap that allows you to maybe, do that?
Well, I think that one of the things we run into difficulty with is we don't have clarity about how we would define success. So often it's about defining success in the short term and not the
Mm.
long term. And I think, what are we doing now and how are we measuring whether it's working or not? And I think it's
Mm.
shocking to me how frequently we find organizations that really don't have a good handle on how they define success in the near term and in the long term.
Tom, you mentioned time zones, and
Mhm.
that reminds me early in my career, I was a network engineer and I worked on a cruise ship.
Wow.
And I was having a massive network outage, and I'm in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea.
Oh, I thought maybe you were going
And
to say you were on the
and
Dali up in.
right, right, and the rest of my team was back in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So there's a little bit of a time gap. I'm trying to fix things. The head server's having massive issues. And finally, we got to calm down, and I got everything fixed. But how do you leverage that time zone difference, and where do you see where it could be an advantage or a disadvantage with a distributed team? Because knowing that I am 7 to 8 hours ahead, depending on the day. How am I going to get back to how am I going to fix this? Because my entire system's having a problem. But where can you take advantage of the fact that we do have some time zone differential? How do you tie that all together and make the best out of it? Or where can it be a hindrance to your project?
Yeah, you're really going three levels deep here because I mean, on the moving time zone is even a greater variable. But let's most of the time that's not the case for folks because we don't see a lot of outsourcing to ship based personnel. But what I would say about that is most organizations, we go back to the question of co-located versus distributed. And in the co-located work environment, we work the same hours of the day. We're in the same location. Communication can happen in an informal way or it can happen in a formal way. And when we move to, screens, it changes the dynamic, changes the way that we have to operate. Now, most organizations try to shoehorn us into let's pretend we're in the same building, even though we might be multiple time zones away. One of the things that's interesting about Accelerance is it's digital native. We're remote native, so we don't have that culture in the way that we operate, but it's very, very common in many, many organizations. And I think the big challenge you have there is unless you think about it. So, for example, let's say that you have a team in Eastern Europe. They're ahead of you time zone wise, and so when you're having your morning stand up, they're mid to late afternoon. And so, what happens from a cycle of work perspective? And often organizations don't think about how that flow works. If a decision is needed, you might lose a whole day in the process. Now, then the gut reaction is we better not do that then. Let's not do this outsourcing thing because it's too dangerous and it's going to cause waste. That's the wrong way to think
Mm.
about it. If you're thoughtful about the processes that you follow and you're thoughtful about how you empower people to resolve conflicts or make decisions in your absence, You can maximize by saying, we're going to define some things by the end of the day here, put them in the work queue for tomorrow, and then have that team have most of the day to work on that to be able to report out results to us. But you got to be thoughtful about the cadence and the interactions and the flow of the work. And often that's overlooked.
Is that thoughtfulness, is that organization viable in small and mid-sized companies? I noticed over the last 10 years, there was a big rush to Latin America, same time zone because of control, time zone overlap, cultural affinity and such. But, given the recent demand of Latin America, obviously, and limited supply, relatively speaking, vis-a-vis Asia, the rates in Latin America have risen quite rapidly in comparison to a place like Asia. But then the argument always gets back to, well, time zone alignment, coordination. Is it viable? Is it more viable today? Are there tools and methods, best practices? Have we evolved? And not to say that tools are going to solve everything, but where are we in that ability for small and mid-sized companies to outsource to Asia?
I think it's doable, but often small and mid-sized companies are not thoughtful about ways to do that with effective results. And what I mean by that is, when you're a small team and you're nimble and you're agile and you're, quick to make changes, what's great, we want in agile software development, we want to learn quickly, we want to pivot quickly, we want to be able to focus on the right things. But if we're not careful to recognize there's a series of steps in a process, and we're gonna map out our process in a way that's going to allow us to maximize the value of either the calendars ahead or the calendars behind us, either way you want to go about doing it. If you're not thoughtful about that, then you're going to be mad that they're not available right stinking now, whatever time zone you're in. But it's really not about your time zone. And I think recognizing that we're building a distributed team across time zones and across cultures and across languages, those are the things that we haven't really thought about because we're used to the concept of co-located teams. We're even seeing that on that return to office stuff that's happening in the US, where there's this demand to bring people back in. And I laugh about that too, because I think about the large companies. I live in the Charlotte area, the large companies in Charlotte that are demanding people come back to the office, and they go to the office and they're like, yeah, I get on a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting with my team members in Chicago and Phoenix, so why am I at the office? I could just be at home. They're not in the office either, or they're in an office in Phoenix or Chicago. They're not in their home, but they could be.
Sure.
So I think that's part of the pieces. Can we come up with a plan that maximizes that for us? And we've seen those small companies be able to do that and do it really, really well. I think about one team we were working with where they brought in some folks from Belarus, and they were very, very effective in getting results with the Belarusian team. And that's, even though they were a small company that was really careful about where they were spending their nickels, they were able to maximize their output, even being multiple time zones away.
Was it just sheer coordination and process, or what other type of human dynamics were at play, cultural dynamics were at play in order to get the most out of the team?
Well, that's one of my favorite topics, Andy. Thanks for bringing that. It set me up right there. I love talking about that. I think that we often overlook the concepts of how powerful culture is in the way that we operate. Culture is the way we treat each other. It's our natural bent toward the way we interact. And we just expect that whatever I do is normal and whatever you do is weird. And especially amplified if we go across borders. That the right way of doing things is however I did things. I remember years ago I was working for a startup, and we had a vendor that wanted to work with us that was based in Portugal. And they tried to sell into the US, and they had terrible, terrible outcomes. They could not sell anything in the US because what was normal and natural for selling in Portugal just didn't translate to buyers in America. Ultimately, they ended up buying the company I worked for so they could have some footprint in the US and they could have some, domestic resources for doing sales who understood those kind of connections and communications. But you don't have to go that far. I think often we don't think about how we communicate or how we evaluate information. How do we lead people? How do we lead a team to make decisions across cultures? What do we do to build trust? How do we handle disagreements that we might have and resolve those disagreements? When we think about something needs to be done soon, what does soon mean? Because it could be very different things across cultures. And I know for sure what soon means in my head. And then how do we persuade other people of our way of thinking, which is a big component in the way that we work collaboratively to try to resolve issues and be able to make great software. And if we haven't thought about those factors, we're going to have less success. I'm not going to say you won't have success. That's one of the things that I find fascinating about the work that we do with clients is often they may ignore some of these factors and they have some level of success. But you can have so much more success if you incorporate some of those ideas into the way you plan the work and the way that you interact with the teams and the way that you communicate and address people. For example, one of my favorite stories is about the US-based team that was working with the Ukrainian team. And when we came in, they said, those guys are jerks. They don't respect us. They're rude. They're awful to work with. Well, from an Eastern European perspective, they culturally tend to give direct negative feedback. It's not uncommon to hear somebody from Eastern Europe say, well, that's stupid. But in the US, if I say, Jarret, that was a stupid question, it's probably not going to go.
Radical candor at its best.
Right. And the thing is, to the American ear, hearing that's stupid, they're translating that and meaning you're stupid. And none of us wants to be thought of as stupid. But it really wasn't that at all, because in the cultural way of thinking that they approach it, the idea is independent of the individual. And so you can criticize the idea and it means nothing negative about the person. But our filter, our natural approach in the US is to think of it differently. And how can you attack my person in that way? So I think that type of miscommunication, and certainly the Eastern Europeans had no negative intent. They were trying to get to the best answer, and their way of resolving conflict or resolving disputes about what the best approach was to go for the smart idea. And if your idea wasn't as smart as theirs, they would say that's stupid.
What is the best way to bridge those communication and cultural differences? There's one way which you might think, well, I'll read a book, or I'll go to Gen AI, or I'll use the perceptions that I have based on social media or whatever. Or do you have to proactively externalize this and talk about this as a group, rather than just try to emulate a style that you think, based on your research, is the best style to use? And how important is it to bring in the group and to put forth the effort and to put it out on the table to say, we need to gel as a group, we need commitment, we need trust, and this is the dynamics. And part B to that question, I guess, would be, would you do that with an Eastern European group who maybe don't like the warm and fuzzy part and they want to be direct?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think foundationally, we have to remember we're dealing with people, that this is not a machine of some sort. We like to talk about it as if it's a machine or like it's an assembly line. It's not. We are depending on the creativity and the resourcefulness of individuals. And humans, while we are kind of tribal, and we do tend to fall into categories, but each of us is unique. And so you may be from a certain country, but your family's culture might be very different from the default culture that surrounds you. So you may think different ways. I mean, I grew up in a family where the English language was very important. We were word nerds. And so my vocabulary and my communication style were different from my peers because what was at home was not the same as what was in the general culture. So I think we can't be too quick to paint with a broad brush and say, oh, Eastern Europeans are like, or Asians are like. That's kind of foolish because we're all individuals. That said, we do tend to trend toward those types of things. And I liked what you said about externalizing it. I think there's a lot of power in being intentional about how we will recognize that there are differences, and difference not wrong. It's just different. So if we can acknowledge that we have differences and we can acknowledge what those differences are, one of the classic ones with Asian teams is they don't say no because it's rude to say no in many Asian cultures. So how do you deal with that? We were dealing with one team that was in Europe, and they were very hierarchical in the way that they thought. We had to make a rule on that team that the project manager was not allowed to speak until after everyone else had spoken. We had to say it out loud. No, you can't stop. You can't say anything, because as soon as the highest paid person said something, no further discussion. We're going to fall in line and do whatever the big boss says.
Yeah.
So I think we have to recognize those things and then be willing to talk about it and say, hey, I think we might be missing each other here. Well, I'm trying to accomplish this way, and you might be approaching it a different way. How do we go about doing it? I mean, what I will say is we've had a lot of success working with teams directly where they bring us in as a third party to help them be able to navigate that process and be able to build the bridges of communication, the tools for communication, the tools for resolving conflict, and really that turn into great ROI on the team. Because if you're not careful about these elements, what happens is you run into unexpected blockers over time. And as you run into those unexpected blockers, you then have to waste the time, blow a sprint or two, trying to figure out how do we dig ourselves out of the hole we got into because A is mad at B, or because we communicated something that we were clear in our mind about, but their expectation, their understanding was radically different. And so they worked really, really hard to build something that was absolutely the wrong thing. And that's happened over and over and over again. So we've had great success in coming in and professionally facilitating these types of sessions to help teams really gel and begin to work together. But it could be done by an organization on its own, but I think often it's very valuable to bring somebody in.
So I know you run these classes, and you're dealing with an engineering culture, which might tend to be more analytical or introverted, and also international cultures, which depends on what region of the world you're in. You might be more or less introverted or extroverted, and just behave in your own cultural ways.
Mm-hmm.
How do you? I wonder how many eye rolls you get, or how many. How the sessions typically run, and then how do you keep it fresh over time?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that an awful lot of engineers will tell you, I'm analytical, I'm not emotional. This touchy-feely stuff is a big waste of time, and I don't care about that. I wish I could just get to the things that matter. Let me get directly to the work.
Yeah.
Now, I will tell you that an engineer is detached and analytical and logical until you tell them their baby's ugly. And as soon as you tell them their baby's ugly, you find there's a bunch of emotion because we're humans and we're all emotional at some level. And I think that what's been interesting to me, because we have worked with many different cultures and many different temperaments of people. And what we find is that, sure, you've got some that are more quiet and some that speak up. But almost universally, people get to the end of that process and they say, I was pretty skeptical when we walked in the door, but I see the value now. I see how this works. Even the teams that we have been in that have been the most mature and have had the best chance of success, according to our estimation, at the end of the process, they said, well, we wouldn't have done it the way you did it, but now that you've done it that way, yeah, we would do that again. There was value for us in that process, which at the outset we were skeptical about. Now, how do you keep people engaged? That takes skill as a facilitator to be able to engage with the different players around the table and get them to speak up. And part of that's defining your rules of engagement. How are we going to interact as the way we go through things, and how are we going to make decisions together? And really, that's one of the values of the workshop experience, is that you're prototyping what's going to happen with this team as soon as you go live with the work that you're doing. As soon as you start doing the real engineering work, you're going to go through these kinds of processes anyway.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Ukraine. In my travels, I did go there, and I remember there's a massive communication breakdown. I ordered hot chocolate. Everybody else got their coffee. I'm sitting and I'm waiting, and basically brought me a cup of melted chocolate.
Nice.
So, but that being said, we have all these like I'm in person and there was a communication breakdown, but we have all these communication tools.
Right.
We have Zoom, we have Slack, we have email, we have Teams. Do you find that being in person sometimes is to the benefit of the project, or do you find that you can get your point across, or your build across, or your sprint across sometimes just using these communication tools, or sometimes you feel like I have to hop on a plane, I have to go break bread and sit down and get to know the people I'm working with to make this relationship a little bit different? I mean, I got the luxury of visiting partners down in Argentina, and we had dinner with them and we played paddle, and you got to sit and understand who they are and meet with them. Do you feel that that makes that whole culture communication piece a little bit stronger than sending emails, sending Slacks, and sitting in a little box being a distributed team?
Yeah, I think I can see two sides of that question. One is, I know that I've worked with remote teams that have been phenomenally productive even without face-to-face interaction. However, I would say that's the exception. And I think we go back to the fact that we're dealing with humans. It's not a machine. It's not an assembly line. And so part of our journey here is looking at it and saying, how do I connect with that person as a person? And I will tell you, there is nothing like breaking bread. The other piece that I think is really, really valuable, and again, often overlooked because I'm looking at teams and I've got some that are in Latin America, I got some that are in Asia, I got some that are in Europe, and I got to pick one of them. Well, when you show up at their building and you see the office they work in, when you see what it takes for them to do whatever it is they're doing in their environment, it changes your perspective. I was in an Eastern Bloc country, and there was an apartment building that was a mile long. I've never seen an apartment building that was a mile long before. That had centralized heat with these big steam tunnels that fed the building because had to pump heat a mile. It shifts your point of view, and that's what I find about travel is that it gives me a perspective that's a very different perspective. And the other piece of it, which I think is very, very important, is people are proud of who they are and what they do. When we can go and see them in their environment where they can brag to us about their cultural items, their things that happen in their city, the work. I remember I was standing on the top of a building in Calcutta, and the building manager looks at me very proudly and he says, here, we have electricity 24 hours a day. It was one of my first international trips, and I was just shocked. I'm like, wow, that's fantastic. What's it like if you're not in this high-tech zone? But,
a lot of candles.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't think about it because it's just not the way that we think, because we expect that we're going to flip the light switch on and lights are going to come on. That's just normative for us, but it's not necessarily that way in other places. And yet they can be highly productive, highly effective at delivering results. Our ability to go and let them brag on their space and show us their world allows us to make them more than two-dimensional. They become three-dimensional in our minds, and we then have empathy for them, and they have an appreciation and respect for the fact that we invested enough to show up.
Tom, how can software development leaders set up the expectations with leadership and stakeholders in order to invest in some of these aspects of team building, which results in measured commitment, measured velocity? How do you set the table so that you will spend time to quote unquote go slow to go fast? Mm-hmm. What does that mean? I want you just to go fast. Don't go slow. No going slow here. Just GSD everything, right?
Are you done yet?
Getting on planes. Why getting on planes? Why do you need to? You got Zoom.
Right.
And so it's sometimes hard to reset those expectations in a way that you could tangibly measure that and demonstrate that if we had not done this, it would not have achieved certain metrics of success. How do you reset those expectations?
Well, I think it actually starts when we say, oh, why should we hire a developer here and their fully burdened rate is going to be X and we can spend less than X by going outside the US? That's often true, but that's really, you're thinking about it from a kind of plug and play Lego piece perspective. And this Lego piece is cheaper than that Lego piece. But what are we buying? Are we buying developer hours? Are we buying developers? I think we're buying capacity to deliver value for our business. And if we're framing it in terms of, I want the cheapest option, and Andy, I know you've heard this, right? Where can I get some cheap developers? Right? And I think that's the wrong question entirely. What we ought to be asking is, how can I maximize return on investment with the work and the money that I'm spending to deliver results? And that frequently involves changing my thinking, changing the way that I do business to be able to be more intentional about delivering value. Agile's great because it allows us to say, I'll work on the highest value thing. You want to change my direction? No problem. If you tell me this is a higher value item. We started working on a major enterprise replacement project for a client. And about 3 months in, they said, we have this other problem that we think is more urgent. Can we spend some time on that? We spent a year, spent a year on that other thing, and it turned out to be a wild success for them. They had about 8 times what they expected the ROI to be, because we were able to really drive in and do a transformation of business work that was happening for them. So on the one hand, you look at it and go, wow, they delayed everything by a year. Well, yeah, on the first thing that they thought was the highest value. But when they really looked at what is our problem that we're trying to solve, where is our value return on investment, we should invest it over here, that was a major explosion in a positive way. So
Mm.
I think, it really comes down to, what problem are you solving? Am I solving the problem of getting cheap developers? Or am I looking at, how do I deliver great value? If I'm saying, how do I deliver great value? If you frame it in that way, you can say to your leadership, look, here's what we know. The experts in this space tell us that we can expect one level of performance if we just engage and throw stuff over the wall. We can expect another level of value if we really see them as a partner and working together to deliver value. And we can see an even higher level of return on investment if we're more engaged personally, by investing time to go over quarterly or semi-annually or annually to go visit with folks so that they can see us as humans and we can see them as humans. And I
Hmm.
think when you're framing it in that way, it's a different conversation. Now, unfortunately, the problem that many of us as software leaders have is, we pitched it to the boss, hey, I can save us money if I go do this other thing. But we weren't saying, how do I maximize performance and maximize output? So partly we have to change our thinking about what problem we are solving. Why did the boss hire us to begin with?
Sure.
That's something that we have to think about so that we can maximize return for the company we work for.
I think possibly the pandemic might have, pushed this a little more for remote work, and now it's kind of the yo-yo. So people are scrambling to adapt to it because it was new. Some people were remote. I was remote pre-pandemic. I'm still remote to this day. But what strategies can we employ to start ensuring that we continue this trend of distributed teams, they stay dominant in the workplace, and this, leads to the future, which, hopefully is still remote.
Well, I might take a little bit of a different approach on that. I think that I don't see it as a goal to be remote. I think now, of course, I'm remote, right? I'm not in the office right now, but I think that the goal is figuring out, how do we maximize return? And if it's through a distributed team, great. If it's through a co-located team, that's okay. I will say, if your thinking is, the problem is people's butts aren't in seats in this building that I'm paying for, you're probably thinking incorrectly about what results look like. And I'm shocked at how many times I will talk with a business executive about a programming initiative, a development project they have in mind. They don't have any metrics, any measurement, any business measurement of whether they're going to succeed or fail. And I'm blown away. So partly it's, what does success look like? What problem are we actually solving? And once we've done that, then we can have a conversation about where those resources need to be, or the types of workflow that we need to have to deliver the results. Now, I'm big on remote teams. I've seen great success with remote teams, but it requires a higher level of leadership on the part of the people who are coordinating that work and thinking about that work. And that's something that really, we want to point to a vendor and say, hey, that vendor screwed this up. Oftentimes it's us. And so we ought to be figuring out, how do I get better at this? What are the skills that I don't currently have that I should stretch in terms of helping people? My son works for a company where he has a boss who's definitely not thought about leadership at all. And so his boss basically every day is saying, how come you don't move faster? And not, how do I equip you? What are the impediments you're facing? What's happening with you? And I think that really leads to, if the beatings are going to continue until morale improves, I can guarantee you're going to have turnover. And that's an element
Mm.
we haven't touched on in this conversation.
Right.
Let's say you get the cheapest resources and you're thinking, I'm brilliant. And I saw this back in the 90s when we were trying to outsource to Asia, because we were like, oh, we're going to charge hundreds of dollars domestically, but we're actually going to pay pennies, and we're going to be geniuses. It's going to be brilliant. We're brilliant. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's not as simple as that arbitrage between the locations. And I think we have to think about, what problem are we solving and how do we get to the best possible result? So I'm a fan of remote work. I think it's a good idea, but I also think that we have to look inwardly and say, how do I develop the skills if the remote team isn't performing, rather than just saying that outsourcing crap doesn't work because I tried it. Maybe you need to look at what you're doing wrong.
Yeah. There's been a number of engagements where you go in and do a small tactical, maybe alignment exercise,
Mhm.
bringing teams together and defining, common definitions and goals and creating KPIs and accountability. But then your engagement has continued on.
Mhm.
So what type of interactions or services are you rendering, during that extended engagement, and why was it important to the companies that you did that with? How did that add additional value? And of course, I'm not trying to, sell Tom into like, lifelong engagements, but there was a reason why a tactical engagement turned long term. Can you
Yeah, I
give
think
me an example?
sure. I think that what often happens is, we really are not. There's this adage that says you give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats for his life. Right? He's got a lifetime of fishing to be able to do. Our goal really is to equip and empower organizations to be able to do these things on their own. What I find is that when it comes to the software engineering tasks, organizations often manage that well. And certainly with a high quality software development partner, the actual turning requirements into shipped code, that usually can work itself out, that part of it works. But what's the other part of the equation? Well, it's the product management elements. What should we build? Which things should we build first? Which things should we deprioritize? And there's
Hmm.
often not a really mature model in place for being able to drive that. And as a result, what we end up with is teams that are not quite sure what to work on, or we throw ideas over to developers before they're ready for development. And then developers have to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out, what did you mean when you asked me to build this thing? And then you end up with this quagmire of lack of success of delivery. And it's easy to point your finger at the partner and the engineers and say, those guys aren't good at what they're doing. But again, it comes back to, am I really defining success for them well? Am I setting them up in a way that's going to help them? And that product management world of prioritizing work and saying no to many, many things so you can say yes to the best, often organizations don't really have a good model in place for that. So where we've seen some success is coming in, helping align the team, get them started in the working on the process, and then we can turn our attention to other places in the organization where we can say, let me help you develop these skills, learn how to fish, so you can do this work without being kind of dependent on somebody who's an expert to help you do the thing. Because it's really more about, how do we equip and empower you to be able to excel on your own, and have the skill set and the processes and the tools in place that are going to support that on an ongoing basis.
Hmm. Excellent. So I think we have time for one more, and I kind of wanted to circle all the way back around, maybe reiterate just a little bit about some of the points you mentioned. So I'm a stakeholder, and I come to you, Mr. CTO, and I said, Tom, beginning next month, I want you to be getting things done better, faster, and cheaper. Get it done. I think offshore is probably the only way you can do it, and I, expect results in 3 months across all of those different metrics. What? How do you need to reorganize or redirect that discussion so that you get stakeholder buy-in and you're on a path to long-term success and not just a short-term honeymoon?
Man, I mean, that's a danger zone to be in. If somebody's coming to you and saying 90 days, I need to see much better performance in every measurable area, or we're going to have a problem. That isn't to say you can't see significant improvement in many areas, but I think we have to come back to, all right, you want us to do more. I want us to do more too. How would we know if we were doing more? How can we agree on what is enough to do that? Oftentimes people say, oh, I just want X. If just is in the sentence, that's usually a problem because you're minimizing what's needed. And if we can say, what are we solving for? And then what could I give you incrementally that would give you the minimum effective dose? Just enough medicine to help you get better, but not so much that you're overdosing on it. Often the scope of change is expected to be this much, when you could get effective results if you delivered this much. When you start to
Sure.
think like that, we're going to do smaller bites faster and get you incremental improvement, which and this is really, really important. We think we know what we need, and we do not, because we are not our customer. Only our
Hmm.
customer knows. We do not know. It is our job to discover what the customer needs. Now, you might say, Tom, I've been doing this a long time. I know these people. I know exactly what they need. Maybe you do, but often you do not. And what you think is very, very important. I'll go back to a previous life where I was working in a startup, and I had guys who had been practitioners, and they had really good intuition, really good instincts about what was needed based on their practical work, which was fantastic for the first 5 years of their company. But the world changed, and their gut was no longer giving them the feedback that was relevant based on the actual needs of the customer. If you
Sure.
say, I know exactly what my customer needs, I would ask you, when's the last time you did it? When's the last time you did exactly the job your customer was doing? Because I bet you, post-pandemic, I bet you there's some things that are different. And you probably don't have the gut feeling that you think you have. So you need a system that lets you try things and get feedback so you can make adjustments. And if you don't have that in place, you're dead. So I would say if I was the CTO and the board members coming to me and saying, you got to fix this, Tom, you got to figure this out. The first thing I'd be saying is, great, we need to reorient your expectations about what this looks like so that I can show you how fast I'm learning and what I'm learning to be able to pivot into a place to get return on investment. Because I'm all about ROI. I want to show you value delivered, and I get it, and I want to make sure that happens. But sometimes, stakeholder, board member, what you're asking for is what you think. It's your hobby horse, your thing that you care about. And what I'm saying is we need to figure out in the marketplace, what is the market responding to?
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, thanks, Tom. Jarret, do you want to wrap it up?
Of course. Well, want to thank everyone for tuning in to Software Without Borders. My name is Jarret Streiner. My co-host is Andy Hilliard. Tom Cooper, thank you very much, and definitely look forward to bringing you back on to learn more. I think our audience has definitely got enough information, but there's a ton more out there, and I think we can dig deeper next time.
Terrific. Thanks.